Hey, everybody, I'm Scott Wikle. You're listening to Fish Creek Radio. I had the opportunity to interview an icon in the music business, and I just couldn't pass it up. And I'm so excited to talk to him. He's a Grammy Award honoree, a Songwriter Hall of Fame member, BBC Lifetime Achievement Award recipient, and his smash hit American Pie resides in the Library of Congress National Recording Registry and was named by the Recording Industry of America the top five song of the 20th century. So I think that's pretty amazing. It kind of says it all right there. It's an honor to welcome Don McLean to the show. Don, how are you tonight?
I'm fine, thank you. Nice to talk to you.
Well, it's a distinct pleasure to have you on the show. I want to thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you.
Well, before we talk about your stellar career, tell me what's going on currently with you. What are you working on, and what's happening for Don McLean?
I'm working on finding places to eat because I'm currently, of course, sequestered like everybody else in my house in Palm Desert. But if you've got to be, quarantined or whatever it is, stay at home or whatever. I don't have this illness, but everybody is supposed to stay in. You couldn't be in a better place than where I am because it's beautiful and sunny every day, and I have a whole lot of things to do in the house, and I'm actually going to start working on one of those little instructional, excuse me, instructional kind of YouTube performances that some other artists are doing to just show guitar pickers and banjo pickers out there how I do a few things and give them some tips and thoughts after doing this for 50 years. So I'm looking forward to doing that. I'm just waiting to get a hold of a tripod, and I don't know, just a lot of something comes along every day to do, and so it's not bad.
Well, that's great. Are you still writing a lot of music?
No, I'm not. I wrote the last album, Botanical Gardens, and that's pretty much it. I don't really want to get into the long-term situation of making an album again and all that. I've got 30 albums out there or more, probably like, with best ofs and everything, probably 40 albums. Recently, I signed an agreement with Time Life and Warner Brothers Records to put every single record that I have ever made on every streaming platform that there is. And so that was a very good thing to do. And Warner Brothers Records is going to release an album I had in the can, which is of songs that I did not write.
Oh, wow.
But as you may know, I've had a few top 10 records of songs that I didn't write, like Since I Don't Have You and Crying and Every Day Overseas, of course. Crying was number one all over the world, and I think number 4 in the United States. So my audience likes the songs that I sing in addition to the songs that I write. So that's going to come out.
Well, fabulous. We'll look forward to that. And folks, you can go to donmclean.com. It's his official website. And of course, pick up all of his great music at all the usual places we get our music these days. And we'll look forward to hearing that material. When did you record this album?
Oh, a few years ago, a couple of years, maybe 3 years ago. The time flies so fast. What I think is 2 years is really 5 years, but it's been a while. But we're doing some remixes on it now, getting ready to go.
Well, that's fabulous. Well, I'm certainly not the interviewer that Dan Rather is, but that was a stellar interview that Dan did with you, and what a great man he is. Did you enjoy doing that?
No, I seriously did. He is the reason he is who he is because he is who he is. He's got a very penetrating subject and asking the right questions. So I've been interviewed by, many great interviewers, including Studs Terkel a couple of times. And honestly, I have to say Dan was the most interesting person to be interviewed by because he did a lot of homework for this. He had a little pad, like a reporter's pad, and it was all written out and very carefully, several pages, and he didn't miss a thing. So he puts a lot of effort into these interviews. I have no trouble talking about myself. That's really easy for me to do. It's what I do most of the time. But I couldn't imagine being an interviewer and having to get into, all these artists that come by, some of whom, you might not like all that much, but it's part of the job, and you've got to deal with them, and I'd be very bored doing that.
Mm-hmm. Well, to me, it's very interesting because I get to hear firsthand a lot of the stories, and I always try to kind of open up a conversation, and maybe something will be said that hasn't been said before. It's obviously, as you mentioned, you've done so many interviews over the years, and I'm sure you get asked the same questions all the time, but sometimes, things come out in a conversation that maybe somebody didn't know.
Mm-hmm. Well, I try to answer questions differently. I don't really... I treat each interviewer as a human being, and I take their questions seriously. It might be a question I never heard, or it might be a question I've been asked thousands of times, but I will try to answer that question in a different way every time because, otherwise you fall into bad habits where you're not thinking and you're not sincere, and it can make you into a phony if you allow some of the aspects of what I do to change the way you are.
Sure. Well, let me ask you: when you first got into the music business, what was your passion as far as what motivated you to want to be a singer and a songwriter?
Well, it all came as a result, really, of, and I got to say this actually quite true. I love the outdoors, and I was sick quite a bit with asthma, so a lot of times I can remember being in the house in the wintertime, with kids sleigh riding out in front of the house, and I was, with my nose pressed against the window, stuck in the house because I had pneumonia. A lot of times my asthma would be very severe and it would become pneumonia or double pneumonia, and I was near death a few times, actually. So when I was healthy, I really wasn't all that good at socializing with people because I hadn't been around them as much as other kids. I had my own world that I was developing. It was a private world. I certainly wasn't. I was trying to do, what everybody else was trying to do, but secretly I was in love with all sorts of things that I heard on the radio and records that I heard and TV shows and music and different artists. And so there was a secret life that was building. And we all have secret lives, but mine ended up being the thing that I used to make a living because I was interested in many, many different kinds of music. And when the folk music thing hit, there was a particular group called the Weavers that I liked a lot, and they still are my favorite vocal group of all time. And I love harmony. Mm-hmm. And I loved Pete Seeger. I loved the fact that he lived in a cabin and that he was, really an outdoors person and, would carry his banjo and guitar on his back and go and sing for people, and then get in the car and, drive home to his cabin on the hill. And I thought, what a great way to make a living. You have your ideas. You're not in a group. You don't need anybody. See, because I had really developed into a rather solitary person. He didn't want to rely on other people.
Mm-hmm.
And so this fit me perfectly. And so I started to learn to play the guitar and learn to play the 5-string banjo, and eventually got to work with Pete Seeger for about 7 years. But my musical tastes and everything going on around me in the 1960s and early 70s was so incredibly musical and creative. In the movies, we had people making their own movies, and then the record business, everybody was making their own records and writing their own songs, and this is a total departure from what was the studio system that they had. In the old days, you'd have a great singer like Sinatra or Ella Fitzgerald, and they would have songwriters, and they would come in, and the label would, and they'd have their own studios, and they'd have their own producers and everything. And you'd go in, and you'd sing the song, and you knew that you would come out with this great pop recording. Well, in the 60s, we decided we were going to do everything. So the albums I made, I do everything. I write the songs, I sing the songs, I arrange the songs, I argue with the producer, I argue with the engineer that I don't like this sound or I do like that sound. Everything's down to me. And this is the way it is for everybody, who came along in that time period, pretty much, unless they just gave their life over to a producer, which is, I would have loved to have done that, but I could never find the right person, although I found some good people.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the reason why I got into realizing that I wanted to, after my father died when I was 15, my father would never have approved of what I did, and probably would never have spoken to me again for the rest of his life, because he was a very, hard Scottish guy, who was authoritarian in the most in the greatest sense of that word. So this was not the path that he would ever have wanted for me. I became a wanderer, and I became a rambler, and I became a free radical in the system, wandering around the country and singing everywhere and observing what was going on and writing songs, and then later making recordings. And the recordings became successful. I had a sound, and no matter what I did, it was played on the radio. So, and then of course I had this massive success with one song, and then there was tremendous success with quite a few others, and a lot of albums were sold and still are being sold. So that changed my whole life. Then suddenly I was a famous person, which I had never planned on being, and I was not suited for fame. I was not a person who, who embraced that. I felt hunted. I felt pursued and dogged in a way I couldn't. You never knew when, somebody was going to jump out of the woodwork or some weird thing was going to happen. So that took a lot of getting used to. That's pretty much it, how it happened. But I kept with me, you see, this is the thing, the love of Buddy Holly and Elvis Presley and rockabilly and that stuff that I really, really liked. And I submerged that in those early days because that was not something I was ready to work with. But that's what changed when I started making records. Then I started expanding. I wanted to have that sound that I heard on the Sinatra record with the violin. So And I Love You So, had a big string orchestra. Anything that was in my mind, I did.
Mm-hmm.
So everything started to change, And the same by Brian Wilson and by the Beatles and by, other artists who became, who got in love with the sounds they could get in the studio. So, in other words, the folk thing was the beginning, and it was the perfect thing, and I grew and grew musically and enjoyed the freedom that I could have in the studio. I mean, why go in the studio and make a record with your guitar?
Right.
When you can have strings, you can have bass, you can have background singers, you can have, all sorts of things. So from the very beginning, the first album, Tapestry, I use everything.
That's amazing. Again, going back to American Pie, and I know, again, you've been asked so many different times about this song. I'm curious. Two things actually. Back in those days, and it's even still somewhat true today, although not as much. Having a song of that length was very difficult for radio. How was that first perceived by the industry with being such a lengthy song? And secondly, was there more to that song? Did you write additional lyrics that were not on the song?
Yes, I wrote some lyrics that were crossed out, and I had some thoughts, and they're all in those original lyrics that I sold a few years ago at Sotheby's for $1,200,000. There were all sorts of, alternate endings and things I was thinking of and plans that I had, for this thing. I never thought it would be a famous song. I just was a fascinating idea that I was in love with, and I had a very good producer named Ed Freeman who made that into a great record, and that's the reason why we're here talking about it, because if that was not made into a great commercial record, it wouldn't have gotten played. So Ed Freeman did that, and he also did the same thing with Vincent, but it was an alchemy. We weren't able to continue that relationship and get more magic out of it. For some reason, it was just really around that American Pie album for some strange reason. But nonetheless, the length of the song, I had to tell a story, so I didn't care how long it took. But the chorus was so catchy, and the record company immediately knew they had a hit, so they just cut most of the verses out, and they put out a single which was 2 minutes long, which had the chorus over and over and a couple of 3 verses in there, and that went to number 1. And then people went and bought the album and heard the whole song, and they would call in and say, we don't want to hear that thing, we want to hear the real song. So they would play the song off the album. Well, that sold lots of albums. You can imagine people wanted to hear the whole thing, because they didn't have the technology to have 8 minutes on a single, because it was a physical thing,
Right.
The single they put out, well, first of all, they put out the short one that was edited, and then the second single they put out was the one that had part 1 and part 2.
Yeah.
They divided the song in half, put half on one side and half on another, and they put the album out. So that's how they did it.
That's amazing. And this may be a difficult question to answer. Looking back on your musical output in awards and acclamations aside, is there a certain project or maybe even a certain song that you are most proud of and can relate to the most out of what you've recorded?
Well, my favorite record I've ever made is a song called Since I Don't Have You, which I recorded with Larry Butler. Larry Butler was Kenny Rogers' producer, and he and Kenny sold millions and millions and millions of records. Larry Butler was a brilliant, one of these crazy guys, came up from Florida, and first of all, he was a fantastic sideman, piano player, and he morphed into becoming a brilliant producer, and he just was. When I met with him in 1978 and we recorded the 2 albums that I made with him, he was so busy that he worked 50 weeks a year, He just in the studio constantly. It took a tremendous toll on him. He had 8 marriages. He had an alcohol problem. He had a drug problem. It was just murder. The work was so, but the money was there and the work was there. This is the thing. A lot of times, and this is some very important thing I'm going to tell your audience, and this especially has to do with country music, but any career, in the entertainment business and in the business of being a musician and doing one-nighters, or, you have to do everything. So you're making radio appearances, you're making television appearances, you're doing 150 to 200 one-nighters a year, all right? Mm-hmm. You're exhausted. And this goes on for years. And you have to go in the studio and make an album every year and come up with this material. So you're doing that. And everybody is just working very, very hard because most of us are not people that came from money. Johnny Cash had 2 choices in his life: become a superstar country artist or pick cotton. That was pretty much what his life choices were. Mm-hmm. And the same thing went for Buddy Holly. If you go to Lubbock, Texas, those are cotton fields there. So he was going to lay floor, linoleum with his father with a Holly Tile Company, or he was going to be a rock and roll singer. Well, not a hard decision.
Yeah.
So, but the thing is that they look at the numbers. Here they're a country boy. He knew he'd be working for, $150 a week if he was lucky. And he's looking at making several thousand a night to sing for an hour. Well, he just can't say no. I got to do those one-nighters and grab that money, and you're just making money. But suddenly, you need a little help. You're taking drugs and doing things to meet that crushing responsibility, but you can't say no, because who can turn down this kind of money when the alternative was picking cotton?
Right.
So you end up like Johnny Cash, a hopeless drug addict, which he was most of his life, and it ruined his health. I mean, when he was 70 years old, he looked 90.
Yeah. Because
those drugs took those years away from him in the front part of his life. He didn't realize that. So it's a bit of you're making a little pact with the devil, because you have a lot of people leaning on you all the time. Your manager, the agents, the record company, they're all leaning on you. And you can't say, look, I'm not going to tour, I'm going to stay home. You don't have that right, You don't get that right until you're very, very, very successful for a very, very long time. I mean, look at the career of Frank Sinatra. I mean, that guy was just worked himself to death. He was such a hard worker.
Yeah.
Even as an old man, he was doing 100 nights a year, everywhere. And then benefits and coming out with 3 albums a year. The guys that didn't write songs, just the straight singers, the minimum for the record company was 3 albums a year. So it's, it's heavy. But again, Frank, he was either going to be, a newspaper boy, or he was going to be a superstar, because he was high school dropout and so on. So this is something people, I don't think really understand. I was a little better educated than I probably should have been, because I went to college. And when I realized after the first 5 or 6 years and the first nervous breakdown that I had to slow down. I just said, screw it, man. I don't care if you like it or not. This is what I'm doing. And I just took control over my workload and what I wanted to do with my life.
Hmm. You mentioned Johnny Cash earlier. I had read that Johnny wrote a song called "I Wish I Could Yodel" after hearing you sing "Lovesick Blues" at his house. Can you
That's correct. Yes,
can
that
you
happened.
tell me that story?
Well, I was hanging around. I'd been at the Grammys, and Cash was emceeing the Grammys, but I had a connection to Johnny Cash through a filmmaker named Robert Elstrom. And Robert Elstrom had filmed Johnny Cash at Folsom Prison and made that movie that we see all the time on TV still. He also made another movie called The Gospel Road, which nobody sees. And that was a reenactment of the death of Christ. And my friend Elstrom, who was the filmmaker, actually played Christ in the movie, and they crucified him on Sunset and Vine, which is pretty funny. But, Cash invested in this movie, The Gospel Road. So Elstrom was also interested in Pete Seeger and in the Hudson River sloop restoration, which we were all excited over, this boat that would sail the Hudson. And I was a part of that from the very beginning. And he discovered me, and he said, I want to make a movie about you. And this was before I was even known. And you can still see clips from this on YouTube. I'm very young in a blue shirt with lots of hair and sweating, and my sleeves are rolled up, and I'm singing some of my songs from the first album, like Orphans of Wealth and songs like that about poverty in America. So Elstrom made this movie about me, and at that same time, it was a lot of always talk about Johnny Cash this and Johnny Cash that. So he mentioned, me to Cash, and his wife. So by the time I met them in 1972 at the Grammys in Nashville, he already knew who I was, and he invited me to come to his house for a couple of days. So while I was at his house, I went with him everywhere. If they went in the car, I got in the car. If they went to the studio, he had a little studio, I went there. If they went to where his offices were, I went there. I just tagged along, for a while. Cash liked me, and I didn't know how to deal with it. This is such a big deal, and I was so over my head anyway, with so many other things, but instant fame, for one thing, that I just didn't know how to react, and so I went in the studio, and I sang a few songs, sang Lovesick Blues, and Cash liked that. So apparently he then went the next week or so and thought it was funny. It was a funny idea of him being able to yodel, but he had a great sense of humor. He was a funny guy in some ways.
That's great.
And he told me an interesting thing, and I've always wished I had fans like this. He said to me, he read his front door. He said, when I was at my worst, I took an axe and chopped this door down. So you can see this guy completely out of control with an axe, angry, smashing away at the front door. He then said that there was a guy named Robert Shelton in the New York Times who wrote the nastiest review of him that he ever got. And he said it still hurts him to think about it today. And I've had some of those, and I know what that feels like. Mm-hmm. And then he told me, he said, I remember being in some place, and we're talking about interviewers, And some interviewer wrote a bad review of my show. He said, and my fans went and burned his house down.
Oh, jeez.
And I thought to myself, now that's what I wish I had.
Wow. That's amazing. Well, Don, I want to thank you for giving me this valuable time today. And you certainly have told some great stories, and there's so many more things we could talk about, but time is limited, and I'd just like to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
My pleasure.
Well, folks, we are going to play some of Don McLean's iconic music, and please visit his website, donmclean.com. This is Fish Creek Radio. Don McLean, thank you again.